Ms. Johnson was nervous but excited as she walked through the doors of Lincoln High School on her first day. She had just been hired as a new teacher for the English department. It was a big change for her. The school was in a busy part of town, and she had heard it was known for having some students who could be hard to manage. But Ms. Johnson believed in herself. She knew she could make a difference, and she was ready to do her best. As she entered the building, she looked around at the long hallways filled with noisy students rushing to their classes. She could hear the buzz of voices and laughter, lockers slamming, and teachers calling out reminders. It was a lively place, and she could feel the energy in the air. Ms. Johnson smiled to herself. This was where she wanted to be. She had prepared, for weeks, making lesson plans and thinking about how she would help her students learn and grow. She was passionate about teaching and wanted every student to feel welcomed and respected in her classroom. But she also knew that starting in a new school could be hard, especially when you were different from most of the staff and students. Ms. Johnson was the first black teacher in the school's English department, and she knew some people might judge her before they got to know her. As she walked toward the teacher's lounge to meet her coworkers, she noticed a group of students standing near the lockers. They were tall and confident with faces that looked serious. Ms. Johnson recognized them as the school's well-known group of troublemakers. They often got into fights or skipped classes, and the teachers found them difficult to handle. They seemed to have a strong influence on the other students, and many were afraid to speak up against them. Ms. Johnson felt a little nervous when she saw them, but she didn't show it. She kept walking, smiling politely as she passed by. One of the boys who looked like the leader of the group glanced at her with a smirk. He whispered something to the others, and they all turned their eyes to watch her closely. It was clear they were sizing her up. She tried to focus on her goal and ignored their looks. She reminded herself that she was there to teach and support her students no matter what. But the feeling didn't leave her. She knew that this group of students might test her patience and strength in the days ahead. Later that morning, Ms. Johnson entered her classroom for the first time. She had decorated the walls with colorful posters of famous authors and motivational quotes. She arranged the desks in neat rows and placed a stack of books on each student's desk. The room looked welcoming and bright, and she hoped her students would feel comfortable there. As the bell rang, students slowly started walking into the classroom. Ms. Johnson greeted each one with a warm smile and asked their names. Most of the students seemed shy but polite. Some whispered among themselves, curious about the new teacher. Ms. Johnson could tell they were watching her closely, trying to figure out what kind of person she was. When the group of bullies arrived, the atmosphere in the room changed. The tall boy who had watched her in the hallway sat down in the back row with his friends. They whispered and laughed quietly, making the other students uncomfortable. Ms. Johnson noticed but didn't say anything right away. She wanted to get through the lesson and see how the day would go. She began by introducing herself and explaining what the students would learn that year. She spoke clearly and confidently, sharing her love of literature and how stories could open minds and hearts. Some students listened with interest, while others seemed distracted. During the lesson, the group of bullies continued to whisper and nudge each other. At one point, the leader made a rude face behind Ms. Johnson's back. A few students giggled nervously, but Ms. Johnson stayed calm. She didn't want to embarrass anyone or create a scene on her first day. Instead, she asked an open question about a story they were reading. Most students raised their hands to answer. The bullies stayed quiet, but Ms. Johnson caught the leader's eye and gave him a steady look. It was as if she was saying, "I see you, and I'm paying attention." The boy shifted in his seat but said nothing. Ms. Johnson didn't press him further, but she made a note to keep an eye on him. At the end of the class, the students started to pack their bags. The bullies got up slowly, still talking among themselves. As Ms. Johnson cleaned her desk, the leader of the group approached her. She tensed for a moment but didn't show it. The boy looked her up and down and said, "You new here, huh? Think you can teach us? We're not easy to handle." Ms. Johnson smiled gently and replied, "I'm here to help every student learn and grow. That includes you. I believe everyone can succeed." The boy raised his eyebrows and gave a small laugh. "We'll see about that." With that, he turned and walked away, his friends following him. Ms. Johnson watched them go, feeling a mix of challenge and determination. She knew her first day had been just the beginning. The real test was still ahead. As she left the classroom, she took a deep breath and reminded herself why she chose this career. Teaching was her passion, and she believed that every challenge was an opportunity to make a difference. No matter what the bullies thought, Ms. Johnson was ready to show them and the entire school what she was made of. The first day was over, but the story was just beginning. The next day at Lincoln High School started much like the first. The hallways were busy with students rushing to their classes, and the chatter filled the air. Ms. Johnson felt a little more confident now, but she knew the day might bring new challenges. She had prepared her lesson plan carefully and wanted to make a good impression. Most of all, she wanted to show the students that she cared about their success. As she walked to her classroom, she noticed the same group of students from yesterday, the ones who had quietly made it clear they did not plan to make things easy for her. They stood near the lockers, chatting with one another, their eyes flicking toward her as she passed. Ms. Johnson held her head high and kept walking, showing no sign of fear or doubt. When the bell rang, signaling the start of class, students took their seats. Ms. Johnson greeted them warmly, calling out their names and asking about their interests. She wanted to build a connection with each student, to make them feel comfortable and valued. For most of the class, things went smoothly. Some students seemed eager to participate, and Ms. Johnson enjoyed hearing their thoughts on the story she was teaching. But as the lesson went on, the group of bullies grew restless. The leader, sitting at the back, began whispering to his friends, who responded with soft laughter. It wasn't loud enough to disrupt the class, but the tension in the room started to rise. Ms. Johnson noticed the change immediately. She knew this was a test, an attempt to see how she would handle pressure. Instead of getting upset or frustrated, she remained calm. She paused her lesson and looked directly at the group. Her voice was steady and kind as she said, "I want this classroom to be a place where everyone feels safe and respected. That means no one is allowed to make others feel small or uncomfortable." The leader smirked but said nothing. Some students nodded quietly, and a few of the bullies looked away. Ms. Johnson hoped that her words had made an impression, but she knew actions would speak louder than anything she said. To keep the class focused, she decided to change the activity. She asked the students to work in pairs and discuss a question related to the story. Most students eagerly found partners and started talking. The group of bullies stayed together, speaking quietly but clearly still paying attention. Ms. Johnson moved around the classroom, listening in on different conversations. When she reached the back row, the leader's group suddenly quieted down. She stopped by and gently asked the leader, "What do you think about this part of the story?" For a moment he didn't answer. The other students nearby looked surprised that she had spoken to him directly. Then, after a brief pause, he shrugged and said, "I guess it's okay. Not really my thing, but it's all right." Ms. Johnson smiled and replied, "That's a good start. Sometimes stories aren't easy to connect with at first. But if you keep an open mind, you might discover something that speaks to you." The leader looked at her differently then, like he was beginning to see her not just as a teacher, but as someone who understood him. His friends still seemed skeptical, but the mood in the classroom had softened. After the activity, Ms. Johnson asked the students to share their thoughts with the class. Some spoke up shyly, but most answered with enthusiasm. The leader stayed, quiet but watched carefully. Ms. Johnson took this as a small victory. At the end of the class, as students were packing their things, the leader approached Ms. Johnson again. This time there was less confidence in his voice. "You're different from other teachers," he said. "I didn't think you'd stick around." Ms. Johnson looked at him kindly and replied, "I'm here because I believe in every student's potential. I'm not going anywhere and I want to help you succeed." He hesitated for a moment, then nodded slightly. "We'll see," he said quietly before walking away. Ms. Johnson felt a mix of relief and hope. She knew this was just the beginning of a longer journey. Earning respect, especially from students who were used to being in control, would take time, but she was ready for the challenge. After class, she sat down to review her notes and think about what had happened. She made a list of ideas to build stronger connections with her students and to create a classroom where everyone felt included. She also reminded herself to stay patient and consistent, no matter what difficulties came her way. Over the next few days, Ms. Johnson continued to show kindness and firmness. She greeted her students with a smile every morning, listened to their stories, and encouraged them to work hard. Slowly, the classroom atmosphere began to change. More students participated in discussions, and the bullying group started to behave more respectfully. One afternoon, Ms. Johnson noticed the leader sitting alone during lunch. She decided to take a chance and sat down beside him. "Mind if I join you?" she asked. He looked up, surprised, but nodded. They talked quietly about school, sports, and music. Ms. Johnson listened more than she spoke, giving him a chance to share his thoughts. For the first time, he opened up about some of the challenges he faced outside of school, things that made it hard for him to focus in class or trust adults. Ms. Johnson didn't judge or offer quick solutions. Instead, she showed understanding and told him she was there if he ever wanted to talk. This small act of kindness made a big difference. It was a moment when the student began to see Ms. Johnson as someone who cared beyond just grades and rules. Word spread among the students that Ms. Johnson was different from other teachers. She was firm but fair, strict but kind. She believed in second chances and wanted to help students become their best selves. Even some of the bullies started to change. They stopped whispering and laughing during class and began paying attention. The leader was still cautious but no longer openly challenged her. There was a new respect in his eyes. Ms. Johnson knew there would still be tough days ahead. She expected more tests of her patience and strength, but she also knew that real change takes time, and every small step forward was a victory. The challenges she faced were not just about teaching English. They were about building trust, breaking down walls, and showing students that they mattered. Ms. Johnson's goal was to help every student believe in themselves, just as she believed in them. That week ended with a feeling of hope. The classroom was no longer just a place for lessons. It was becoming a place where students felt safe, heard, and respected. Ms. Johnson was beginning to understand that teaching was about more than textbooks and tests. It was about people. It was about heart, and she was ready to give both her heart and mind to her students. The days passed, and Ms. Johnson felt the change happening little by little in her classroom. She knew that earning respect was not something that happened overnight. It was a slow process, like planting a seed and watching it grow. Some students were opening up more while others still held back, unsure about trusting the new teacher. One morning, as the students filed into the classroom, Ms. Johnson noticed the usual group of bullies sitting together, but this time they were quieter than before. The leader sat with his arms crossed, watching the room carefully. Ms. Johnson greeted the class with her usual warm smile and began the day's lesson. She had planned a special activity, a group project that would encourage teamwork and help students learn from each other. She hoped this would help break down some walls and build friendships where there had been tension before. After explaining the project, Ms. Johnson divided the class into small groups. She made sure to place the students thoughtfully, mixing those who got along well with those who needed to learn how to work together. The bullies ended up in the same group, which was no surprise, but this time Ms. Johnson was ready. As the groups began to work, Ms. Johnson walked around the room, listening and offering support. She stopped by the group with the bullies and quietly observed their interaction. At first, the leader seemed uninterested, leaning back in his chair and crossing his arms. But as the others started discussing ideas, he began to participate. Ms. Johnson decided to give him a chance to take the lead on part of the project. She asked him to share his thoughts with the group and see if he could help organize their work. At first, the boy looked surprised, but then he nodded slowly. He took a deep breath and began speaking clearly. To everyone's surprise, he had some good ideas. His group listened and started to follow his plan. The other boys and girls in the group looked more relaxed and focused. Ms. Johnson smiled quietly, feeling proud that he was stepping up. As the class continued, more students got involved and shared their opinions. Ms. Johnson noticed that even some of the quieter students were speaking up, encouraged by the group's energy. The classroom felt alive with conversation and cooperation. After the project time was over, Ms. Johnson asked each group to present what they had done. When it was the Bullies group turn, the leader stood confidently in front of the class. He explained their work clearly and answered questions from his classmates. Ms. Johnson could see the surprise on many faces. This was a different side of him. When he returned to his seat, some students whispered to each other, impressed by his effort. Ms. Johnson gave him a proud look and he smiled back briefly, a small but meaningful connection. Later that day, during lunch, Ms. Johnson saw the leader again sitting alone. She remembered their earlier conversation and decided to join him. This time they talked about the project and how it felt to work with others. He admitted that it was harder than he thought, but also kind of fun. He said he never realized how much could be done when people work together. Ms. Johnson listened carefully and told him that teamwork was a skill that would help him not just in school but in life. The boy nodded, seeming thoughtful. "I guess I never had a teacher who really believed I could do things like this before," he said quietly. Ms. Johnson smiled gently. "Sometimes all people need is someone to believe in them. That's why I'm here." Their talk was interrupted by a few friends calling him from across the cafeteria. He stood up and waved goodbye. Ms. Johnson watched him go, feeling hopeful. Back in the classroom, Ms. Johnson decided to share a story of her own during the next lesson. She talked about her childhood and the challenges she faced growing up. She wanted her students to know that she understood struggles and mistakes, and that success was possible for anyone willing to try. The students listened quietly. Some nodded. Others looked surprised to hear about their teacher's life. Ms. Johnson used the story to teach a lesson about perseverance and self-respect. She encouraged the class to share their own stories and experiences. At first, only a few students spoke up, but gradually more joined in. The room filled with honest conversations, laughter, and even some tears. Ms. Johnson felt the classroom becoming a community, a place where students felt safe to be themselves and express their thoughts. The bullies, too, seemed to soften. They still had moments of joking and teasing, but it was less about causing trouble and more about connecting with others. One afternoon, a student in the Bullies group asked Ms. Johnson for help with a homework assignment. She was surprised but pleased and gladly offered extra support. The student worked hard and began to improve. The leader noticed and gave a small nod of approval, signaling a quiet respect between them. Ms. Johnson knew that change was happening not because she demanded it, but because she showed respect and kindness first. She believed that when people feel respected, they are more likely to treat others with respect too. There were still difficult moments, of course. Some days, the leader and his friends tested her patience, pushing boundaries with jokes or distractions. But Ms. Johnson stayed calm and consistent. She reminded them gently of the rules and the importance of respect. She never gave up on them. One day, after a particularly challenging class, the leader stayed behind. Ms. Johnson was cleaning the board when he spoke. "Ms. Johnson," he said, "I want to say thanks for not giving up on me. I don't always show it, but I'm trying." Ms. Johnson smiled warmly. "I see your effort, and I'm proud of you. Keep going." He nodded and left the room with a little more confidence than before. As weeks turned into months, Ms. Johnson saw more changes in her classroom and in herself. She learned to be patient and flexible. She celebrated small victories and kept her focus on the bigger goal, helping students grow into responsible and confident young people. The bullies were no longer the same group who had tried to intimidate her on the first day. They had started to respect her leadership and even looked up to her in some ways. The school environment was becoming friendlier, more focused on learning. Ms. Johnson's story was spreading through the school. Other teachers admired her strength and kindness. Students who had once been afraid to speak were now raising their hands with confidence. Through it all, Ms. Johnson never forgot why she chose teaching. She wanted to make a difference in the lives of young people. She believed that every student had the potential to succeed if given the right support and respect. and she was determined to be the teacher who made that happen. As the school year moved forward, Ms. Johnson noticed more and more small changes happening not only in her students, but also in the way the whole school began to see her. The once loud and challenging group of students who had tried to test her on the very first day now behaved differently. They weren't perfect, but they were beginning to show respect, not just to Ms. Johnson, but to themselves and others as well. One morning, Ms. Johnson arrived early to prepare her lesson. She was arranging the desks when she heard a soft knock at the classroom door. To her surprise, it was the leader of the group who had been the most difficult during the first weeks of school. He stood quietly holding a notebook. "Good morning," Ms. Johnson said with a smile. "Come in, how can I help you?" He stepped inside, looking a little unsure. "I was wondering if you could help me with something. I'm stuck on the essay. For tomorrow, I don't really know where to start." Ms. Johnson's smile grew warmer. This was the kind of moment she had hoped for, a student reaching out for help. "Of course. Let's sit down and go through it together." They worked, side by side, Ms. Johnson guiding him gently through the process of organizing his thoughts and writing them clearly. The boy listened carefully and even asked questions. For the first time, he seemed genuinely interested in learning. Ms. Johnson felt proud, knowing that her patient efforts were beginning to pay off. After their session, the boy thanked her quietly and left the classroom. Ms. Johnson watched him go, feeling a wave of hope. She knew these moments were important. Sometimes all a student needed was someone who cared enough to listen and help. Word about Ms. Johnson's kindness and dedication spread quickly. Other students began coming to her for help, and even teachers from other departments praised her approach. The school atmosphere was slowly shifting, growing more positive and encouraging. One afternoon, Ms. Johnson received an invitation to speak at a school assembly. She felt nervous, but excited. It was an opportunity to share her story and inspire others. Standing in front of the whole school, she spoke about the power of respect, understanding, and believing in each other. She told them about the struggles she had faced as a new teacher and how she had learned to face challenges with patience and kindness. She encouraged the students to support one another and to never give up on their dreams. After her speech, many students came up to thank her. The boy who had been the leader of the Bullies was among them. He shook her hand firmly and said, "Thanks for helping me believe I could do better." Ms. Johnson smiled, feeling deeply moved. It was a reminder of why she had chosen to become a teacher. Back in the classroom, Ms. Johnson continued to create lessons that were not only educational, but also meaningful. She introduced books and stories that talked about courage, friendship, and overcoming difficulties. She invited her students to share their own stories and experiences, building a strong sense of community. One day, she noticed the leader of the group helping another student with a difficult assignment. It was a small act, but to Ms. Johnson, it meant the world. The boy who had once tried to challenge her was now showing kindness to others. During a class discussion, Ms. Johnson asked the students what respect meant to them. The answers varied. Some said it was about listening, others about being kind or honest. When it was the leader's turn, he said quietly, "Respect is about giving people a chance, even if they're different or you don't agree with them." The room was silent for a moment. Then some students nodded in agreement. Ms. Johnson felt her heart swell with pride. This was exactly the lesson she wanted them to learn. As the year went on, more students joined in activities that promoted teamwork and friendship. Ms. Johnson organized group projects, reading circles, and even school events where students could showcase their talents and support each other. The principal noticed the positive change and praised Ms. Johnson during staff meetings. Other teachers asked her for advice on how to connect better with their students. Ms. Johnson was happy to share what she had learned, that patience, kindness, and believing in people could create real change. One afternoon, the school held a special event to celebrate the end of the term. Parents, teachers, and students gathered in the auditorium. Ms. Johnson was invited to speak again. This time, she shared stories of growth and hope from her classroom. She talked about how challenges could become opportunities and how respect and kindness could turn even the toughest situations around. The audience listened attentively, some wiping tears from their eyes. After the event, many students came to thank Ms. Johnson. The leader of the group approached her with a big smile. "Ms. Johnson," he said, "I just want to say thank you. You didn't give up on me or the others. Because of you, I'm starting to believe in myself." Ms. Johnson felt tears of joy well up in her eyes. "I'm proud of you," she said softly. "Keep working hard, and remember, you can do anything you set your mind to." That evening, Ms. Johnson reflected on the journey she had been on, from the first day when she faced doubt and challenges to now, where she saw students growing into their best selves. She felt grateful and fulfilled. She knew that teaching was more than a job. It was a calling, and she was ready to keep making a difference, one student at a time. The story of the new teacher who refused to be broken by bullies was no longer just a story. It was real. It was alive in the hearts of the students who had once doubted her and now looked up to her. Ms. Johnson had shown them that respect, kindness, and belief in others could change lives. And for her, that was the greatest lesson of all. The final month of the school year had arrived. The days were warmer. The trees outside the classroom window were full of green leaves, and there was a new kind of energy in the air. Students talked excitedly about summer vacation, final projects, and end-of-year activities. But for Ms. Johnson, this time meant something more. It was a moment to reflect on the journey she and her students had taken together. The classroom that had once felt like a battlefield was now a place of calm and growth. The students respected each other, and most importantly, they respected themselves. They had learned that their voices mattered, their actions had meaning, and their futures were in their own hands. Ms. Johnson wanted to end the year in a way that reminded the students of how far they had come. She decided to create a memory board in the classroom. She brought in colorful papers, pens, markers, and asked each student to write down one thing they had learned during the year, not just in the subjects, but in life. At first, the students hesitated, unsure of what to write. But soon, one by one, they picked up pens and began to reflect. Some wrote about patience, some about friendship, and others about believing in themselves. The memory board quickly filled with words like trust, respect, growth, and hope. The most surprising message came from the boy who had once been the group's leader, the same boy who had tried to challenge her on the first day. His message was short but powerful. "I learned that it's never too late to change." Ms. Johnson read his note silently, a soft smile forming on her face. She remembered how he had once walked into her classroom with defiance in his eyes. Now he walked with confidence and calm. His journey had not been easy, but it had been real. A few days later, the school held its annual Student Recognition Day, an event where students were honored for their hard work and improvement. Ms. Johnson had been asked to nominate one student from her class who had shown the most personal growth. She thought carefully. Many students had shown progress, but one name stood out. On the day of the ceremony, students gathered in the gymnasium, dressed nicely and smiling with excitement. The principal gave a short speech, then invited teachers to present their awards. When Ms. Johnson's turn came, she walked to the microphone and looked out over the crowd. Her heart beat fast, but she felt calm and proud. "This year," she began, "I met a classroom full of unique and amazing students. Each one of them taught me something new. But one student in particular showed that real change is possible when someone decides to try. This student went from challenging the rules to becoming a leader, from avoiding classwork to helping others succeed. I'm proud to present this year's Growth Award to..." She paused for a moment. "David Thomas." The crowd clapped, loudly. David, surprised, stood up slowly. His classmates cheered, some clapping him on the back as he walked to the stage. He accepted the small trophy from Ms. Johnson with wide eyes and a smile that reached all the way to his heart. "Thank you," he said softly. "You earned it," Ms. Johnson replied, giving him a warm nod. Later that day, David came to Ms. Johnson's classroom. The other students had already gone home and the room was quiet. He looked around at the memory board, then turned to her. "I didn't think I'd ever get something like that," he said. "Not me." Ms. Johnson sat at her desk and folded her hands. "But you did. Because you chose to grow. You showed everyone what's possible when someone doesn't give up. David smiled, then looked down. You believed in me. Even when I was acting like I didn't care. I believed in the person you could become, Ms. Johnson said. And now look at you. You're becoming him. There was a long pause. Then David said, Do you think I could do something good one day? Like, really good? Ms. Johnson stood and walked over to him. I don't just think you could, I know you can. That moment stayed with both of them. On the last day of school, the classroom was filled with laughter and hugs. Students exchanged notes, shared stories, and some even cried. Ms. Johnson handed out final report cards, along with personalized notes to each student. She wanted them to know that their efforts had been seen and that she believed in each of them. When it was time for everyone to leave, the students lined up to say goodbye. Many thanked her, and a few even gave her small gifts, homemade cards, a flower, or a piece of candy. Ms. Johnson accepted each one with a grateful heart. David was the last to leave. He walked up slowly, his backpack slung over one shoulder. Don't know if I'll ever have another teacher like you, he said. Ms. Johnson smiled warmly. You might not, but remember what you learned this year. Carry it with you. I will, he said. And maybe, one day I'll come back and visit. Tell you what I've done. I'll be here, she said, and I'll be proud of you. With that, David gave her a quick wave and walked out the door. Ms. Johnson stood there for a moment, watching the hallway slowly empty. The classroom was quiet now. She looked around at the desks, the memory board, and the sunlight streaming through the windows. It had been a challenging year, but also a beautiful one. She sat down and opened her journal, writing down a few thoughts about the year. At the top of the page she wrote, They tried to break me, but instead we built something stronger. As the final bell rang, Ms. Johnson closed her notebook and stood up, her heart full of peace. She walked out of the classroom with her head held high, ready for the next chapter, whatever it might be, because she had learned something too. Kindness is not weakness, patience is not giving in, and when you believe in someone, you give them the power to believe in themselves, and that she knew was the beginning of everything.